Okay, so we're just going to be looking at labels because I think it's quite important for us to understand how to read labels and know what it means, when we look at different ingredients to help us to make better food choices. I've got a few examples of packaging here. So if we look at, for example, this can of beans, it's got the traffic light system on, which most products that you can buy in the supermarkets these days have all got some form of traffic light system, which makes it quite easy to see what is in there and kind of helps you judge whether it's a good choice or a not so good choice. So what the traffic light shows is fat, and it breaks that down into saturated fats, sugar and salt. So those are the main things that will appear on there. I think it's quite important to always look at whether they're talking about per 100 grams or per portion, because that can be a little bit confusing because it's always a bit different. If I look at this box of cereal, for example, it's got it as per 40 grams, which would be serving size, whereas something else might have it listed as per 100 grams, or this, for example, per half a can. So that is something to consider. And so this can that I've got here, everything's green, which kind of means that it's generally a good food. So your fat is green, the saturated fat's green, sugar green, and salt green. So what that means is that all the amounts of these are low enough to be considered that that this food is a healthier food. So then we get amber or orange as well. So I've got on this cereal box, I've got a few ambers. So that's kind of medium in the middle. So when it comes to sugar, anything below 5 grams is considered low. So that would be green. Anything above that would go into amber. And then you also get red, which I haven't got any reds here. So that would be considered high in sugar and something to be avoided or to not eat as much of. When we're looking at fat, it is anything below 1.5 grams per 100 grams is considered low fat. And then when we're looking at salt, so this one is green and the salt 0.1 grams, anything that is 0.3 grams or lower would be considered low. But I think the main thing is that they've tried to make it quite simple. We don't need to remember all these numbers. If you just have a quick glance at these, you can see, yeah, that's probably a good choice. I've got all greens. Yeah, that's not so good. I've got a green and 3 ambers. But again, better than maybe something next to that on the shelf that's all reds. I've got another one here where you've got two greens and 2 ambers. So it's telling me I've got low for fat and saturated fat, and then kind of in the middle for sugar and salt. But again, it's, I think, useful when you're comparing products. So if you're standing in front of a shelf full of cereals and different granolas and, you just think, oh, this is a minefield, I don't know what to pick. That's quite a good way of just having a quick glance without knowing too much about how much of everything I should be having. You can just look at it and go, that's all green. That's, half red, half orange. I think I know which one I should be picking, the green one. So I think that's quite a very useful guide, and it's on pretty much everything that you buy in a supermarket that's packaged, which is quite helpful to keep an eye on to help us know, are we kind of maintaining a balanced diet? It's just kind of a good guideline, along with ingredients, which is another thing we could look at.
Yeah. So on the back of your labels, on everything, it will say ingredients. So the first ingredient is always the most. So this is a bag of granola. So our first ingredient, as you would expect, would be whole grain oats. So it's always good to look at that and start looking at where sugar comes in, actually, because that's always an interesting one. For our nutritional information on here, it's got per 100 grams and per portion of 45 grams. This, I think, is also important because especially with cereal and those sort of cereals that are more aimed at kids, it's actually can be really quite interesting to weigh out your cereal and see whether you're having a 45-gram portion or not.
Yeah, I think most people would find that is definitely not the case, and they're probably doubling up on that. Yeah, quite often.
Well, my son would quite happily have some of this Weetabix. He likes it because it's got protein written all over it. And per 2 biscuits, that's a portion, we would have something like 3.9 grams of fiber, 13 grams of protein, so quite high protein. But you've still got 12 grams of sugar in there. So if we look at it, we've got a list here: energy, fat, of which is saturates, carbohydrates, of which is sugars. And this is the key bit that I get people to look at: how much added sugar is in there. So 12 grams, that might not sound a huge amount, but bearing in mind my son would eat double that. So he'd eat 24 grams of sugar, and 4 grams of sugar equates to a teaspoon. So it soon adds up. And yes, you've got some protein in there, so there'd be 26 grams of protein. So that would help to balance that out a little bit, but it's still not great.
He'd still be having around 6 spoons of sugar just in that meal, which is, you wouldn't think that would be okay to sit down and eat 6 spoons of sugar.
No, absolutely not. And I think this is, like you were saying, it's really worth becoming your own detective. And foods like this are quite easy to see, but things that we might not think that there's added sugar, like pasta sauces, for instance, and those ready-made sauces that are predominantly tomato based. I know there was some news out a few years ago. One of the big makers, one of their jars had something like 15, 16 teaspoons of sugar in it, which was horrific, because you wouldn't think of a bolognese sauce as having additional sugar in there.
Which is something we're going to talk about in another session, but about making your own things from scratch, because you can see what's going in there. And like you say, you wouldn't be putting loads of sugar in there. Yeah.
No. And salt as well. We often have additional salt in processed foods because it's used as a preservative. And again, if you're cooking from scratch, you've got control of whether you add that or not.
I've got a good little slide to show from the British Heart Foundation about what you're just talking about there.
So when you're looking at that ingredients list, start looking at how many times sugar is mentioned, and it won't just be called sugar. In this graph, we can see it's being called just syrup. So it might be high fructose corn syrup, it might be glucose, it might be fructose, maltose. These are all different types of sugar, and quite often there'll be more than one in a product.
And I think people look at the ingredients list and they think, oh, this is all right. It's got, one of these things in malt syrup and and fructose and whatnot. Oh, this is all right. But essentially, in the body, it's treated in exactly the same way as sugar and converts into glucose, exactly like, sugar in a bar of chocolate would do. Yeah.
And when a product is low sugar or no added sugar, it's quite often got artificial sugar in there, which still is detrimental to the body. And if you look at things like low fat products, as soon as they take the fat out, they tend to put sugar in because there's a lot of flavor that comes in fat. So really be a detective here and start scanning those labels. And what I found, being a mum myself, is that when foods are targeted for children, especially those young sort of primary school age children, they're higher in sugar. So things like fromage frais, the flavored yogurts, things like that. If you buy the more adult versions, they have a lower sugar content too.